Look, today we're tackling a deeply sobering but absolutely essential chapter of human history. We're going to dive straight into the historical records to impartially analyze the staggering scale of atrocities committed across multiple theaters during World War II. It's a heavy topic, for sure, but the goal here is to really understand the mechanics of these events through clear, structured information. We need to grasp exactly how total war impacted humanity. Section 1. Early campaigns of brutality, conquest and mass suffering. 300,000. That's an almost incomprehensible number, right? But back in December 1937, which was actually 2 years before Hitler even invaded Poland, Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital of Nanking. And over a brutal 6-week window, what we now call the Nanking Massacre, soldiers murdered up to 300,000 Chinese civilians and disarmed troops. The historical record here is just harrowing. We're talking about thousands lined up and machine-gunned right into the Yangtze River, along with widespread, systemic sexual violence inflicted on countless women and girls. But even amidst that staggering darkness, there were these remarkable moments of resistance. Foreigners living there, like German businessman John Robb and American missionary Minnie Vautrin, actually set up a safety zone. They managed to shelter roughly 200,000 civilians. Not only that, they documented the atrocities and literally smuggled the evidence out to the world. And while commanders like Iwane Matsui and Hisao Tani were later executed for all this, it's worth noting that modern denials of the massacre's true scale still spark major diplomatic tension between Japan and China today. Moving to Section 2, the architecture of genocide, systemic elimination. 33,771, that is the exact number of victims murdered over the course of just 2 days in September 1941 at a ravine called Babi Yar, just outside Kiev. 33,771 Jewish men, women, and children were killed. Under this cruel guise of resettlement, they were marched to the edge of the ravine, stripped, forced to lie down on top of those who had already been killed, and then shot by German forces and Ukrainian police. The scale was so massive, and the execution so rushed, that witnesses later reported the earth literally moving for days afterward from victims who had been buried alive. And tragically, we see a really similar systematic approach at Panari, just outside Vilnius in Lithuania. There, up to 100,000 people, again, mostly Jews, were shot directly into pre-dug fuel storage pits over a 3-year period. But what's particularly chilling here is that by 1943, as the Soviets started advancing, the Nazis actually tried to cover their tracks. They forced a chained burning brigade of prisoners to dig up and incinerate the bodies to destroy the evidence. Amazingly, though, 11 of those prisoners managed to dig a tunnel and escape. They survived, and their crucial testimony is exactly how this dark history was brought to light. That brings us to Section 3. Cruelty towards the defenseless, prisoners and subjects. Now we have to talk about Unit 731, which operated in Manchuria from 1936 to 1945. This was a facility commanded by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, completely disguised as a water purification unit, but in reality, it killed at least 10,000 living human subjects. To make the daily torture psychologically easier on the guards, the prisoners were completely stripped of their humanity and referred to just as logs. These people were subjected to some of the most horrifying procedures imaginable, with absolutely no anesthesia. We're talking vivisections, deadly pressure chamber tests, and brutal frostbite experiments. And it didn't stop there. Unit 731 actively weaponized pathogens. They actually dropped plague-infected fleas on Chinese cities and deliberately poisoned water supplies with cholera, causing tens of thousands of deaths in field tests. But historically speaking, the aftermath of all this is incredibly complex. The United States ended up granting Ishii and his top researchers total immunity. Why? In exchange for their biological data, which the US viewed as just too valuable to lose to the Soviets. So ultimately, it was only the Soviets who actually tried 12 members of the unit later on at the Khabarovsk war crimes trials. That same kind of total dehumanization completely defined the Bataan Death March in 1942. When 76,000 Filipino and American soldiers surrendered in the Philippines, they were immediately forced into a brutal 60-mile march in intense, suffocating tropical heat. Guards flat out denied them water, even as they marched right past artesian wells. Anyone who fell behind was beaten or buried alive. Thousands perished on that road alone, and thousands more died in the horrifically overcrowded conditions at Camp O'Donnell. General Masaharu Homa was eventually executed for failing to control his troops during this massive atrocity. All right, Section 4, Scorched Earth and Retaliation, Punishing the Innocent. So, cut to February 1945. You've got trapped Japanese troops who actively defy their direct retreat orders and basically unleash the Manila Massacre.
Under Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, these naval troops systematically murdered an estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians. The historical record documents just absolutely horrific acts at the Red Cross building, refugees being burned alive in the German club, and outright massacres inside the Manila Cathedral. After the war, General Yamashita was executed for failing to control his subordinates in this incident, which actually set a highly controversial legal precedent in the laws of war that military historians still debate today.
And we see a strikingly similar, brutal kind of retaliation over in France in June of 1944. Frustrated by local resistance attacks right after D-Day, the SS Division Das Reich surrounded the quiet little village of Oradour-sur-Glane. The structure of this massacre was just coldly calculated. Men were locked in barns, shot in the legs, and burned alive. Meanwhile, the women and children were asphyxiated and burned inside the village church. All told, 642 people were murdered. The post-war trial in 1953 actually deeply divided France, mostly because forcibly conscripted French Alsatians were among the perpetrators sitting on trial. Let's move on to Section 5, the strategic bombing debate, the ethics of air war. Now, this is where we get into some really intense historical debate. In February 1945, the bombing of Dresden utilized a highly precise two-wave tactic. At this point in the war, Dresden's population had swelled to over 1 million people, mostly fleeing refugees. The British RAF and American bombers dropped a staggering 4,000 tons of explosives. The tactic went like this. High explosives were dropped first, specifically to blow out windows and rip off roofs. Then came Wave 2, incendiaries that plunged straight into those newly exposed wooden interiors. The result was roughly 25,000 deaths. That specific two-wave tactic engineered a truly terrifying physical phenomenon known as a firestorm. We're talking temperatures reaching over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. It gets so hot that it creates its own self-generating winds. Winds so strong they literally pulled victims into the flames and sucked all the oxygen right out of the air, suffocating people who were hiding down in bomb shelters. Now, Allied commanders like Arthur Harris vehemently defended this as a totally legitimate strike on a vital transport hub. On the flip side, Nazi propagandist Joseph Goebbels massively exaggerated the death toll to 200,000, and that spun up a massive historical debate that frankly persists to this very day. We see that exact same ethical debate mirrored over in the Pacific Theater. In March 1945, U.S. General Curtis LeMay ordered low-altitude B-29s to drop M69 cluster bombs, filled with napalm, straight over Tokyo's densely packed wooden neighborhoods. It created the single deadliest air raid in human history, killing an estimated 100,000 people in just one night. And the historical memory of this event is completely split. The American perspective often views it as a grim but absolute necessity to break morale and avoid a catastrophic ground invasion. But the Japanese perspective mourns it as a horrific, tragic slaughter of innocent civilians trapped in boiling canals. Which brings us to our final part. Section 6, Justice and Historical Memory, Truth and Denial. A prime historical example of evidence suppression is the Cotton Massacre. Back in the spring of 1940, acting directly on a document signed by Joseph Stalin, Soviet forces set out to systematically eliminate Poland's entire leadership class. They executed approximately 22,000 Polish elites. We're talking military officers, doctors, teachers, engineers, and priests. They were shot in the back of the head and dumped into massive hidden graves in the cotton forest and several other remote sites. And the timeline of the subsequent cover-up is just wild. When German forces actually discovered those graves in 1943, the Soviets vehemently denied having anything to do with it. They even went so far as to formally blame Nazi Germany at the Nuremberg trials. Because Poland fell behind the Iron Curtain after the war, the real truth was suppressed for decades. It literally wasn't until 1990, under Mikhail Gorbachev, that the Soviet Union officially admitted responsibility. And even today, while expressing regret, Russia continues to resist officially classifying the massacre as a genocide. It really goes to show how historical memory is constantly manipulated and contested. For decades, the Soviet Union deliberately erased the specific Jewish identity of the victims at mass execution sites like Babi Yar and Panari, officially labeling them merely as Soviet citizens. But then you contrast that intentional erasure with a country like France. Following the war, Charles de Gaulle ordered the ruined, charred remains of Oradour-sur-Glane to be left completely untouched. He wanted it preserved forever as a permanent physical memorial so that no one could ever forget what happened there.
Then there's this incredibly chilling admission from U.S. Major General Curtis LeMay, again, the architect of those Tokyo firebombings. He once plainly stated, "If we had lost the war, we would have been prosecuted as war criminals." It's a statement that perfectly highlights the ultimate gray area of global conflict, right? It's a stark reminder that the definition and certainly the prosecution of war crimes are very often determined entirely by the victors.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a question to chew on. How do we actually reconcile the brutal, unforgiving mechanics of total war with the pursuit of justice? And ultimately, who gets to write the history of these atrocities? Grappling with these historical facts, as difficult as they are, is how we ensure the victims are never forgotten. Keep questioning, keep learning, and please share your thoughts on this incredibly complex history in the comments below. Thanks for joining me today.